Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. The city was frozen solid. A polar vortex, they called it on the news. I called it a nightmare of burst pipes and overnight shifts. I'm a boiler technician, and that night, the whole city seemed to need me. But the call I couldn't ignore came at 2 a.m. The observatory building, a luxury apartment block in the old quarter, the kind they advertise with restored stone facades and uniformed doormen. Their main boiler had died. I drove through deserted streets, dirty snow crunching under my tires. The doorman was waiting for me, an older man shivering under a too expensive coat. He led me through a lobby of marble and polished brass. The silence was total, but it was an angry silence. The silence of rich people without heat. The boiler room's in the sub-basement, he told me, his breath forming a cloud. The service elevator's in the back. The elevator took us down one level. We stepped out into a modern service hallway, well lit with polished concrete floors. But he kept walking toward a metal door at the far end. He pulled out a ring of keys and opened a heavy lock. "The elevator doesn't go down here," he said. "You'll have to use the stairs." He opened the door. A blast of freezing air, much colder than the street, rose from the shaft. It smelled of dampness, wet stone, and something else. Something old, like clothes stored in a trunk for a century. "The boiler's all the way down. It's kind of a maze," the doorman added, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm staying up here. I don't go down there unless it's absolutely necessary." He wasn't coming with me, I got it. I turned on the headlamp on my work helmet. The stone steps were irregular, worn by time. I descended. The sound of my boots on the stone was the only noise, besides the distant dripping of water. The sub-basement wasn't a basement. It was a catacomb. It had been built in the 19th century. The walls were ashlar stone, not concrete. The ceiling was a low vault that forced me to duck my head. A maze of narrow passages opened in all directions, poorly lit by flickering bare bulbs. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. And the pipes, steam pipes thick as a man's arm, ran along the ceiling and walls covered in a fine frost. I followed the main pipes, my only guide in that maze. The dripping sound was louder now, and I wasn't alone. I heard other sounds. The groan of the building settling in the cold, the low whistle of an air leak somewhere, and something else. A whisper. I stopped. The whisper traveled through the pipes themselves, as if someone were speaking very quietly at the other end of the line. I chalked it up to air pressure, to the acoustics of the vaults. I pressed on. The basement opened up and I saw it, the boiler. It wasn't a modern stainless steel boiler. It was a beast, a monster of riveted cast iron the size of a small van. It looked like an old locomotive, a relic of the Industrial Revolution. It was dead, cold to the touch. I set down my toolbox. The silence here was different, heavier. I looked around. The room was huge, full of shadows the bulbs couldn't penetrate. I saw a brass plaque on the wall, green with age. I walked over to read it. Holy Face Hospice, 1888. This wasn't an apartment building. This had been something else, and the basement was the oldest part. I got to work. First thing was to check the pilot light. I opened the inspection hatch. The inside was frozen. No gas. I checked the main supply valve. It was closed. That was strange. A main valve doesn't close itself. They're heavy. They require a tool. Okay, I muttered to myself, let's see. I set my toolbox next to the valve. I took out my biggest wrench. I turned to grab the wrench. It wasn't there. I'd left it right there, in the box. I looked around. Maybe it had fallen. I shined my flashlight on the floor. Nothing, just damp concrete. What the hell, I said. I turned back to the box, and my heart lurched. My toolbox, which I had left next to the valve, was now on the other side of the room, 30 feet away, next to a pile of old coal sacks. I froze. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no one there. The doorman was upstairs in the service hallway. I walked slowly toward my box. The air around me seemed to grow colder, a piercing cold like needles. I picked up the box. All my tools were inside, perfectly arranged, including the wrench. My mind searched for a rational explanation, a tremor, a vibration in the floor. But the floor was solid rock. I went back to the valve, tried to ignore it. I had a job to do. People were cold. I was cold. I fitted the wrench on the valve. It was stuck with rust and cold. I pushed with all my weight. Nothing. I needed leverage. I grabbed a piece of abandoned pipe to extend the wrench handle. I pushed. The valve turned, a millimeter, with a metallic screech that was swallowed by the vaults. And then I heard the sound. Click, click, click. It came from a dark passage to my left. The sound of something small, hard, rolling across the stone floor. I aimed my flashlight. The passage was empty. But right at the edge of the light, something glinted. A marble, a blue glass marble. I bent down to pick it up. It was so cold it burned my skin as if it had been pulled from liquid nitrogen. I dropped it instantly, and then I heard the laughter. It wasn't loud laughter. It was a whisper, a muffled, childish giggle coming from everywhere at once. It seemed to come from inside the pipes, from the shadows, from behind the boiler. I jumped to my feet, my wrench in my hand. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice sounded pathetic, absorbed by the stone. The laughter stopped. Silence. And then in the dust covering the top of the boiler, where no one had reached in years, I saw a print. Not a boot. The print of a hand. A small hand. Very small. I spun around, panicked, lighting up the dark corners of the room. My flashlight beam caught something. Movement. In the passage at the back, where the marble had come from, I saw a silhouette. No. Several. Small. Blurred. Figures of children, pale and almost transparent, watching me from the darkness. They had no faces, just dark smudges where their eyes and mouths should be. I backed away, tripping over my own tools. No, I said. The figures didn't advance, they just watched. I turned back to the valve. I had to get out of there. I had to open the gas, light the boiler, and leave. I pushed the wrench with desperate force. The valve gave a little more. Clang. A metallic sound behind me. My torque wrench, a heavy tool, had flown from my box and hit the opposite wall. The children, they were playing with me. I turned toward them. "Leave me alone, I have work to do." The laughter returned, louder this time, icy, joyless, and the cold in the room intensified. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was the cold of the grave. I felt it stealing the heat from my body. Felt my fingers starting to go numb inside my gloves. I realized something. The boiler hadn't broken. They had shut it down. They didn't want me to light it. They liked the cold. The cold was what kept them here. Strong. I looked at the valve. I looked at the dark passage. I was trapped in the basement with a job to do and a bunch of malevolent souls who wanted to make sure I stayed frozen with them. The cold. That was the first thing I tried to ignore. I felt the presence of each of them, an invisible pressure stealing the heat from my body. The laughter had stopped, replaced by an expectant silence, like a group of kids waiting for their prank victim to react. I looked at the main valve, my only way out of this frozen tomb. It was stuck, and the presence of the pale figures in the passage reminded me why. I took off my gloves, even though the cold burned my hands. I needed to feel the metal, the mechanical problem. I couldn't let terror paralyze me. I grabbed the wrench again and the piece of pipe I was using as a lever. "I don't have time for this," I muttered, trying to make my voice sound firm. I pushed the wrench with all my strength, ignoring the freezing air surrounding me. The valve gave another millimeter. The metallic screech was agonizing. At that instant, I felt something. An icy pressure on my back, like the palm of a small, temperatureless hand. I jumped forward, hitting the stone wall. I spun around, breathing hard. There was nothing. But the laughter returned, closer this time. It seemed to come from inside the boiler, from the pipes. It was a hollow sound, joyless. A low, constant murmur trying to undermine my concentration. I pushed again. The valve gave a bit more. I was halfway there, not much left before it would open. Then the atmosphere changed. The children stopped playing. I heard a sound above my head. A metallic scraping like a shovel dragging across concrete. It came from the ceiling, from the upper level of the basement. The sound approached, dragging, and then crack. One of the bare ceiling lights exploded, throwing the room into deeper darkness. The only light was from my helmet, which now seemed dangerously lonely. I worked frantically. I ignored the cold seeping under my clothes, ignored the growing darkness. I put all my weight on the lever. I focused on the metal, on the resistance, on the job I had to do. I wasn't a man, I was a tool. And tools don't feel fear. The valve turned a bit more and stopped, locked. It wasn't rust. It was total resistance, as if it were welded from the inside. I pushed until the muscles in my arms screamed, my posture bent and tense. It didn't move. I collapsed against the boiler, gasping. I was sweating, but the sweat froze on my skin instantly, covering me with a layer of frost. The wrench slipped from my fingers. I realized I didn't have enough strength. I needed heat to expand the metal. I needed lubricant. I needed a bigger tool. I looked at my toolbox. Something was wrong. I opened it completely. My hand torch and a can of penetrating oil were missing. They disappeared while I was working, stolen silently by invisible hands. I had to go get them. I had to go deeper into the maze. I turned on my flashlight and walked toward the passage where I'd seen the figures. The silhouettes had disappeared, but I knew they were there. I felt the thick atmosphere, as if I were walking underwater. The passage led me to a file room. Rusty metal shelves covered in dust, filled with notebooks and faded index cards. I read a card by my flashlight. Names, dates, Holy Face Hospice, 1918, the flu epidemic. Hundreds of children died here. The place was soaked in their grief and terror. While I was reading, a notebook slid off a shelf. It fell at my feet, opening to a page. There was no visible hand. It just fell. The page showed charcoal drawings, children's drawings, sad faces out of proportion, and drawings of boilers, of the room where I was, and drawings of a hand, a small hand turning a valve. I stood up, breathing shallow. They weren't passive victims. They were aware, malevolent, and playing their game. I moved forward, ignoring the notebook, ignoring the shelves that seemed to lean toward me. The passage narrowed and descended, more stairs, a deeper level. The cold became unbearable. It was like entering a walk-in freezer. The air stung. My boots crunched on an invisible layer of ice on the floor. I realized this was the level where the temperature was kept intentionally low, where they'd found their eternal peace. I saw the room at the end of the passage, a large, empty room, and there they were. They weren't shadows. They were clear, though pale. Figures of children still lined up along the wall. They seemed to float a few inches off the ground. In their old dresses, their wool caps, and their gaunt faces, no eyes, just dark cavities. They were the ones waiting, frozen in their eternal vigil. And on the other side of the room, under a pile of broken pipes, I saw the gleam. My torch. They looked at me. All together. I felt a wave of nausea, not from fear, but from the cold they were transmitting. "I need that," I said, my voice barely a whisper that froze in the air. I started walking toward the torch. The children didn't move, but as I got closer, the air between us filled with a sharp scraping, like nails on a chalkboard. It was a sound designed to break sanity. I walked slowly. It was a test of wills. My reason against their terror. Slowness was my challenge. I reached the pile of pipes. I crouched down. The torch was there, and next to it, the can of oil. I grabbed them. They were covered in frost. When I stood up, the children had moved. They stood in the center of the room, blocking my way back. And then one moved. A small boy in an old, threadbare nightgown. He took a step, and then another. His movement was jerky, like a poorly assembled robot. He was heading toward me. He wasn't looking at my eyes, he was looking at the torch in my hands. "It's not for you," whispered a voice coming from the girl beside him. I realized they didn't want me to join their games. They wanted my tools. They didn't want heat. They wanted me to fail. I ran. I passed by them. As I did, I felt the air break. It was cold in its purest form, like being hit by a solid object. I stumbled, but kept running. I got back to the boiler room. The valve. My only way out. I lit the torch. The small blue flame seemed like a sun in that frozen darkness. The children hadn't followed me. The heat repelled them. I directed the flame toward the base of the valve, heating the stuck metal. The metal hissed and squealed. The heat felt good on my numb hands. I worked fast, applying the penetrating oil while heating. I heard something else. It wasn't coming from the passage. It came from the stone wall next to the boiler, a dry scraping as if they were crawling inside the rock. The valve was hot. I grabbed my wrench and repositioned the lever. The children were there again, 10 of them, blocking the only path I had left. I pushed. The valve gave a bit more with an agonized squeal. It was almost open. "No, it's ours," hissed a multiple voice, now audible, not just in my head. The children didn't move. The stone wall behind me started to crack. The cold returned, this time with violent concentration directed only at me. It was a physical attack. The cold wasn't just a sensation. It was a force. It was pressing me, trying to crush me against the iron of the boiler, a coordinated attempt to extract every last drop of heat from my bones. My gloves were useless now. I felt my knuckles solidify around the lever handle. The crack in the wall extended with a dry crunch, and a blast of frigid air came out of it, with a smell of earth and dampness, as if the grave itself were opening behind me. My fingers refused to obey. They'd seized up, immobile from the cold emanating from the children and the wall. I knew this was the real test. It wasn't a fight of strength, but of will. If I let go of the wrench now, I'd become their next source of heat. I felt the hollow laughter in my ear, celebrating my imminent defeat. The valve, just a little more. I needed a few seconds. I knew that if the cold paralyzed me now, I wouldn't get up again. The fight was no longer about the gas, it was for my soul. The pain became a silent scream. I wasn't going to give in. The iron lever had fused with my frozen hands. My fear was the fuel that kept them strong, but it was also the only thing reminding me I was still alive. I realized it wasn't just brute force that was missing. What stopped me wasn't rust. It was the despair they imposed. I wasn't going to let it swallow me. With the last reserve of rage I had left, a burning rage born from the fear of being another object in that cold, I screamed. It wasn't an audible sound. It was an internal scream, an absolute refusal to become the heat source for those souls. They weren't going to steal my life. They weren't going to win. I made one last effort. I pushed the lever not with my arms, but with all the weight of my body, my chest pressed against the boiler. The metal gave. The valve turned the last stretch. The sound was an explosion, a deafening whoosh of pressurized gas being released. A spectral scream of rage and pure pain flooded the sub-basement. The children recoiled violently. The cold retreated as violently as it had come, leaving a momentary void of heat in my chest, an internal burn. The crack in the wall sealed shut with a final crunch, as if it had never existed. I'd broken their ritual. I stood up, staggering. The pale figures of the children vanished. They didn't dissolve. They simply switched off, sinking into the stone and concrete. The wave of heat had swept them away. I didn't waste a second. I had to light the boiler. I ran to the control panel. The steam coming from the pipes was now so hot it burned the air. Power had returned. With trembling hands, I followed the ignition sequence. I pressed the ignition button. Nothing, just a metallic click. No, I gasped. The whispers were returning, weak from the back of the passages. They were regrouping. I pressed the button again. Click. Failure. The moisture and cold had damaged the igniter. I pulled out a lighter from my pocket, a cheap plastic one I used to test for gas leaks. The wheel turned, but my fingers were so numb I couldn't make it spark. I tried once, twice, 3 times. The gas hissed. The whispers grew closer. On the 4th try, a small yellow flame came to life. I stuck my hand into the pilot hatch. Whoom! A ball of blue fire singed my eyebrows and hair. The boiler, the old iron beast, roared to life with a boom, sucking in the gas. The steam pipes began to groan. The mechanical life of the heating had defeated the cold of death. I grabbed my toolbox, left the wrench and torch, didn't care. I ran out of the boiler room. The roar of the engine was a sound of life, but I knew my escape wasn't over. They were wounded, but still there. I reached a hallway where I stopped. A pile of old lead pipes which hadn't been there before blocked my path. I pushed them, my numb body fighting against the dead weight. Behind me, I heard a dull thud and the sound of splintering wood. They were trying to corner me. The passage visibly narrowed. Shadows materialized in the corners, trying to confuse me. Speed was my only defense. I ran through a passage I'd swear wasn't there when I came down. The basement's architecture was changing, turning against me. The stone walls now seemed to drip black, icy water that made the floor slippery. The shadows lengthened, moving independently, trying to hook my ankles. I felt the whispers again, but now they were weak moans, complaining of injustice. "You abandoned us," the voices said. "It's our cold." "Don't leave," another voice whispered directly in my ear. A wooden door that had been opened before was now slammed shut in front of me. I didn't stop. I hit it with my shoulder. The wood was rotten and gave way, but it cost me precious time. I fell into a flooded room. The icy water reached my knees, stealing what little warmth I had left. I had to wade through, the water dragging my movements, while the laughter returned, now from beneath the water's surface. I reached the other shore, soaked and shaking violently. I kept running. I reached the stairs leading to the modern service hallway, my only way back. The stairs were blocked. Piles of debris, dirt, and old bricks had fallen from the vaulted ceiling, forming an impossible-to-climb barricade. The hospice was fighting to keep me. The pile of rubble reached the ceiling, a compact mass of despair. I didn't stop. I started climbing, my knees scraping against broken concrete. I felt cold pressure on my legs, small hands trying to grab me, pull me down. They were weak, but there were many. I ignored them, concentrating all my energy on the climb. I felt the terror of their hands, sticky and cold, trying to drag me back into the darkness. I grabbed a piece of iron, pulling with all my strength. Desperation gave me brutal strength. But they weren't just weak hands. They were hands coming out of the debris itself. A pale hand closed around my ankle. I screamed in pain and surprise. I pulled a long screwdriver from my belt and stabbed it into the hand. The sound was dull, like piercing wet clay. The hand dissolved into frozen dust. I kept climbing. The pile of debris was moving, unstable. Stones rolled, trying to make me fall. It wasn't a collapse. It was an entity. It was the remains of the hospice, animated by the souls of the children. "Stay with us," the voices whispered from the bricks. "It's cold down here." "And it'll stay cold," I shouted, hitting another hand coming out of the dirt. I fought on the wall of debris, my gloves torn, my hands bleeding, my lungs burned. Finally, I reached the top. I jumped over the wall of rubble and reached the service hallway, clean and modern. The white light blinded me. I turned around breathless. The metal door leading to the sub-basement slammed shut behind me with a final boom. Behind the door, I heard a weak chorus of laments, a sound that quickly faded, drowned by the heat of the service hallway. I fell to the floor, gasping, my body in shock. The doorman must have heard the bang. He came running from the reception, his face full of genuine terror this time. "My God, what happened? The heat," he said, his voice shaking. "On," I gasped. "It's on. Call an ambulance. I've got hypothermia." The following hours blurred together. The dry heat of hospital blankets, the white glare of lights, the sound of life support machines. They examined me for frostbite, for shock. But no one examined my mind. I never told the truth. Never said I'd fought the spirits of 100 dead children to open a valve. They discharged me 4 days later with instructions to rest and avoid extreme cold. When they finally let me out into the outside world with the dry heat of the blanket still burning my skin and memory, I realized my victory. The cold had given them power, but I'd answered with the fury of life, with the heat of my purpose. I'd done my job. I'd lit the boiler. The terror, I knew, wasn't in the cold or in death, but in the void of despair. They fed on that void, and I hadn't given in. I brought heat and life to that place and swept them away. I looked at my hands, scarred and trembling. The basement had kept the dead souls, I'd kept mine. And that, I knew, was the only victory that mattered. Taking the shortcut was stupid. As a traveling salesman, my life was ruled by efficiency, by optimized miles and kept appointments. My car was my office. But that day, the GPS promised to save me 2 hours, routing me through a network of back roads that looked like scratches across the mountainous landscape. The sky was leaden, a sickly gray, and the radio only hissed with static that was starting to sound almost like breathing. I should have seen it as a warning. The storm didn't arrive gradually. It was like the sky split open. A wall of water slammed into the windshield. The wipers fought, useless against the deluge. The road turned into a river of mud. I slowed down, my knuckles white on the wheel, and then the car coughed. A metallic sound, a sharp knock under the hood, and then the engine choked out. The car slid a few more yards on inertia, the power steering dying in my hands, and stopped on the muddy shoulder. Silence. Just the roar of the wind and the deafening drumming of rain on metal. I hit the wheel, tried to start it, nothing. The starter didn't even turn over. Total death. I pulled out my phone. Of course, no service. The car's GPS blinked, showing my position as a blue dot in the middle of a vast green nothing. The road I'd come in on didn't even show up anymore. I sat there for 10 minutes waiting for a miracle, for the storm to let up, for another car to pass. Neither thing happened. The cold started seeping in. I knew I couldn't stay there. It would be an ice trap when night fell. I saw lights through the downpour. Faint, yellowish, maybe a mile away in a low valley the road skirted. A town. Shelter. There was no other option. I put on my jacket, got out of the car, and sank into the mud up to my ankles. The wind nearly ripped the door off. I locked the car and started walking, head down against the freezing rain. The walk was torture. Every step was a struggle against the mud and wind. Water got down my collar, soaking me to the bone. It took me half an hour to reach the town's entrance. There was no welcome sign. Just a main street perfectly cobbled that began where the mud ended. A line of demarcation too precise. As if the town rejected the disorder of the outside world. The first thing that hit me was the silence. The storm raged overhead, but the town itself was mute. No wind howling between buildings, no sound of overflowing drains. It was a thick silence, as if the architecture itself absorbed it. The houses were perfect, identical. Small two-story structures with gabled roofs and white-painted wooden porches. Not a shingle out of place. Not a leaf in the yards. Not even the mud from the storm seemed to stain the sidewalks. Everything was immaculate. I saw a brighter light at the end of the street, a garage. Mechanic shop said a carved wooden sign, no neon, just a yellow bulb illuminating it from above. I headed there, shivering. The garage door was open. Inside, a burly man had his back to me, tightening a nut on an old tractor engine. He didn't hear me arrive. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding hoarse. The man didn't startle, didn't turn abruptly. He set down the tool he was using on a metal tray with slow, deliberate precision. Then he turned. He was huge, but his movements were economical, fluid, effortless, like a well-oiled machine. He wore an immaculate work coverall without a single grease stain. He looked at me. His eyes were clear, gray, and completely empty. There was no surprise, no curiosity, no compassion for my soaked state. A smile formed on his face. It was a perfect smile, symmetrical, but it didn't reach his eyes. My car broke down on the road about a mile from here. "I think it's the engine," I explained. "Quiet Valley," he said. His voice was a smooth baritone without inflection. "Things don't break down often here." "I need help. I need you to look at it. Or a phone to call a tow truck," I pleaded. "The phone doesn't work in the storm," he said, as if it were obvious. "I'll bring your car." He didn't ask where exactly it was. He simply walked out of the garage into the rain, got into an old tow truck I hadn't noticed, and disappeared into the storm. He came back 15 minutes later with my car hooked up. He set it down in the middle of the shop with the same precision with which he'd set down the wrench. He opened the hood. I huddled by a radiator trying to get warm. He didn't seem to notice the cold. His hands moved over the engine. He wasn't searching. He went directly to the spots. His movements were inhumanly efficient. After 5 minutes of silence, he straightened up. The alternators burned out, and it fried the engine control module. "Can you fix it?" I asked. "I can," he nodded, wiping his hands on a clean rag. "But the part," he said, pointing to the control module, I don't have it here. I'll have to order it. How long will it take? I asked, my heart sinking. The fixed smile returned. 3 days, maybe 4. With the storm, shipments get delayed. 3 days, I was trapped. I looked around, desperate. Where can I stay? Is there a hotel? He raised a heavy arm and pointed slowly toward the street. The inn, at the end of the square. Mrs. Robles always has room. I paid for the tow. The price was reasonable, exact. He gave me a handwritten receipt with perfect, almost printed penmanship. I left the shop. The storm had died down, turning into a fine drizzle. I walked toward the square. The town was even more unsettling in the gray evening light. There was no one on the streets, not a kid, not a dog. Just the perfect houses and the silence. The inn was the same as the other buildings, just a bit bigger. Valley Inn, said another carved sign. I went in. The interior was equally spotless. Smell of beeswax and bleach. An older woman stood behind the counter, polishing a glass that already gleamed. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun. She smiled at me. It was the same smile, the mechanic's. Symmetrical, polite, dead. I need a room, I said. My car broke down. A setback, she said. Her voice as monotone as the mechanic's. We always have room for one more, 20 a night, in advance. I paid. She gave me a brass key. Room 4. Dinner served at 7, not a minute before, not a minute after. Rules are posted on the door. I went upstairs. The room was sterile. Iron bed, wooden dresser, a crucifix on the wall. Everything clean to the point of pain. I read the rules. No smoking, no noise, no visitors. Leave the key at reception when going out. I went to the window. It overlooked the main street. I looked at my watch. It was 5:58 in the evening. The town was still, bathed in the pale twilight. And then it happened. My watch hit 6 o'clock. At that exact second, all the doors of all the houses on the street opened in unison. One resident, man or woman, came out of each one. Each one carried a broom. They positioned themselves in the center of their porches, and as one being, they began to sweep. The movements were identical. The right arm described the same arc. The broom hit the porch at the same instant. A rhythmic sound, a swish, swish, swish. That was the only thing breaking the town's silence. They didn't look at each other. They didn't talk. Their faces were serene with those empty smiles. I stood frozen, watching. This wasn't a custom. It was a mechanism. They were marionettes moved by an invisible string. They swept for exactly 5 minutes. At 6:05, they all stopped at once. They turned around, went into their houses, and closed the doors. The street was empty again. The silence pressed down, heavier than before. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. I went down to the reception. Mrs. Robles was still there, now folding napkins. What just happened? I asked, trying to make my voice sound casual. The sweeping hour? She looked up. The smile didn't waver. It's the sweeping hour, she said, as if it were the only possible answer. But everyone at the same time, it's some kind of tradition? She tilted her head like a bird that doesn't understand a sound. It's the hour. Things must be done at their hour. That's how we maintain order. I didn't know what to say. I went to the inn's sitting room. I sat in a stiff armchair. I saw my reflection in the dark window glass. Something felt off. I looked toward the street. In every window of every house across from the inn there was a face, a resident, staring at me, all perfectly still, all with the same fixed smile. They didn't wave, they just watched. I jumped up and drew the curtain. My heart was pounding hard. I wasn't waiting for a part. I'd walked into a trap. I stood with my back to the window, the rough curtain fabric in my hand. My heart pounded against my ribs with a dull force. The room's silence was absolute, but my mind was screaming. I was trapped. It wasn't a guess, it was a certainty. I went to my room door and turned the deadbolt. A flimsy piece of metal that offered me no real security. I heard the click, and it seemed like a scandalous sound, as if the whole town had heard it. I checked my phone again, still dead, no service. It was a useless brick. I sat on the edge of the rigid bed, looking at the rules nailed to the door. Dinner served at 7, not a minute before, not a minute after. I looked at my watch, 6:30. The idea of going back down, of facing Mrs. Robles and her dead smile, turned my stomach. But the idea of not going down was worse. What happened if I broke a rule? I'd seen the broom ritual. I'd seen the faces in the windows. This wasn't a town of weird people, it was a mechanism. And I was the piece that didn't fit. The one that had just entered the gears. The piece that, without a doubt, they were going to polish. At 6:59, I stood in front of my room door. My heart beat in my ears. There was a smell in the hallway. A smell that wasn't food. It smelled of beeswax and something else, something metallic and cold. When my watch hit 7 o'clock, I heard a metallic sound in the hallway. The tinkling of a small bell, soft but penetrating. At the same time, I heard other doors in the hallway open. A click, a click, a click. All at once, I opened mine. 2 men came out of the adjacent rooms. Both wore identical gray suits, old-fashioned but impeccable. Both looked at me, and both smiled at me. The same empty, symmetrical smile. They said nothing. They turned in unison and started walking toward the stairs. I followed at a prudent distance. Their steps were identical, their heels hitting the wooden floor in perfect synchrony. It was a slow, marching rhythm. The dining room was an austere hall with a long wooden table in the center. Several people were already seated. The burly mechanic was there, his work, coverall, still immaculate. Mrs. Robles came and went from the kitchen. The 2 men in gray and I sat in the only free spots. There were 8 people total. No one spoke. The only sound was the tick-tock of a large wall clock. At 7:05, Mrs. Robles closed the kitchen door. She stood at the head of the table. "Dinner is served," she said with her inflectionless voice. It was as if a switch had been flipped. In unison, the 8 people took their napkins and unfolded them, placing the triangle of cloth on their laps in a single fluid movement. I imitated them half a second late. I earned a quick corrective glance from the woman sitting across from me. A look that wasn't angry, but pure evaluation, like a supervisor measuring a factory defect. Mrs. Robles served the soup, a pale broth with vegetables cut into millimetrically perfect cubes. She placed the last bowl in front of me. The steam rising from all the bowls was identical. The mechanic lifted his spoon. Everyone lifted their spoon, me too, this time on time. They brought the spoon to their mouth. They blew gently, a collective exhalation barely audible, and drank. The silence filled with the sound of 8 people swallowing at the same time. It was horrible. I ate the blandest soup of my life, concentrating with every fiber of my being on not breaking the rhythm. Lift, blow, drink, lower. It was a macabre routine. I tried to think about my work, my life outside of here. But it was impossible. The rhythm invaded everything. The beat of silence. I tried to break the spell. I needed to hear a human voice, an inflection, something that wasn't rehearsed. "Mrs. Robles," I said, my voice sounding thunderous in the silence. The movement stopped. 8 spoons stopped halfway to 8 mouths. 8 pairs of empty eyes turned to look at me. There was no anger, no annoyance, just expectation. 8 heads tilted a couple of degrees to the left in unison, as if a single neck controlled them. They waited for the next input. "The soup is good," I lied, feeling like an idiot. Mrs. Robles, from the head of the table, nodded slightly. "It's soup time." And as if that were the signal, the 8 heads returned to their vertical position. The 8 spoons completed their journey. Dinner continued. The main course was boiled chicken and more vegetables. It was eaten with the same rhythmic precision. No one asked for salt. No one drank water outside the exact moment between bites. In a moment of panic, my hand trembled and my fork hit the edge of the plate. The sound was like a gunshot, a sharp clink that vibrated in the air. Time froze. Everyone stopped. This time the empty smile seemed to tense a fraction of a millimeter. A man next to me, one of the gray-suited ones, slowly turned his head. He didn't look at me. He looked at my plate. Then he looked at my hand, then back at my plate. He said nothing. Slowly, with surgical precision, he reached out his hand, not toward me, but toward my fork. With his index finger and thumb, he moved it a centimeter, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the plate. Then he withdrew his hand and returned to his initial position, motionless, waiting for me. Corrected, the gesture seemed to say. I felt a wave of hot humiliation followed by a terrifying cold. They weren't simply correcting my actions. They were correcting the disorder. My trembling, my fear, my individuality. All of that was disorder, and they were the tools to polish it. I lifted the fork again, my hand visibly shaking, and I continued eating. The mechanism restarted. The psychological terror didn't come from a direct threat. It came from the correction. It came from the certainty that any deviation, however small, was detected, recorded, and would be corrected. I was a virus in a perfect operating system, and the system was starting to quarantine me. At 7:45, everyone finished the last bite at the same time. They left their utensils on the plate in the same position, parallel. They folded their napkins and placed them to the left of the plate. They stood up. The sound of the 8 chairs scraping back was one, and they left the dining room in single file, in the same order they'd entered without a word of goodbye. I was left alone with Mrs. Robles, who collected the plates with mechanical efficiency. "The mechanic," I began to say, my voice trembling slightly. "The 3 or 4 days, and was that a reliable estimate?" She stopped with a stack of plates in her hand. She gave me that dead smile. "Mr. Herrero is very precise. The time it takes is the time it takes." "And what am I supposed to do for 3 days?" I asked, my voice rising a notch. "There's nothing here, no TV, no phone." She tilted her head, the same bird gesture I'd seen at reception. "You don't have to do anything," she said softly. "You just have to be. The town takes care of the rest. Rest helps the body adjust." She turned her back on me and went to the kitchen, leaving me with that last cryptic phrase. I went up to my room. I locked the door and propped the chair under the doorknob. I felt exhausted, as if I'd done strenuous physical work. I went to the window and pulled the curtain aside just a centimeter. The street was dark. The drizzle had stopped, and the faces had returned. They were in their windows as before, but now there were also people on the porches, standing motionless in the darkness, under the pale light of street lamps, all looking at my window. Room 4. They weren't watching to make sure I didn't leave. They were watching to make sure I didn't deviate. They were waiting for my next mistake, and I realized that the mechanic wasn't waiting for a part. 3 or 4 days wasn't the shipping time. It was the time they needed to repair me. That certainty chilled my blood. The room's cold was nothing compared to the ice that ran down my spine. I was in a place designed to break me down, a workshop for polishing souls. I pulled away from the window abruptly, dropping the curtain. The fabric raised a cloud of dust that danced in the single ray of light. I sat on the bed, my mind racing at feverish speed. I tried to find a logical way out. I couldn't run, the storm, the road, the destroyed car. I couldn't fight, they were an entire town. I couldn't reason. Their minds were a closed loop, a symphony of a single tone. I could only obey. I could only survive the 3 days and pray that the part would really arrive. But what if the part never arrived? What if repairing me meant I would never leave? That first night was torture. I didn't sleep a wink. The chair under the doorknob was a useless comfort. The town's silence was unnatural. No crickets, no hooting owl. Just the tick-tock of the large dining room clock, a sound that rose through the house's foundations and vibrated in my mattress. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was Quiet Valley's metronome. At 3 in the morning, I heard one of the gray-suited men in the next room cough. A dry, controlled cough. A second later, I heard exactly the same cough in the room on the other side. Synchronized. Then silence. No. I wasn't going to wait. Panic was better than apathy. Fear was better than that dead peace. I realized that their strength was their weakness. They were perfect, rhythmic, predictable. I was a mess. I was chaotic, scared, and unpredictable. And that was my only weapon. I waited for the gray light of dawn to filter through the curtain. I wasn't going to wait for the breakfast bell. At 5:30 in the morning, the town would be at its lowest point of activity. It was my only chance. I removed the chair from the doorknob with infinite care. I opened the lock, the click sounding like an explosion in my ear. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The smell of beeswax was suffocating. I went down the stairs on tiptoe, avoiding the creaky steps. The large wall clock in the dining room marked the rhythm. Tick-tock. I saw the pendulum swing, a shiny brass orb. I felt a wild impulse to stop it, to break the glass. But that would make noise. I reached the front door. It was unlocked. I stepped out into the cold, misty morning air. The street was empty. No faces in the windows. It was too early for the ritual. I started walking fast toward the town's exit. My plan was simple. Get to the road, ignore the car, and head into the forest. I'd rather face the elements than them. I reached the mechanic shop. The big door was closed. I walked past. I reached the end of the street, the point where the muddy road met the town's asphalt. And I stopped dead. It wasn't a fallen tree blocking the way. It was worse. It was a wall. A perfect wall built with the same cobblestones as the street, 3 meters high, stretching from side to side. It wasn't a new construction. It was covered with moss, as if it had been there 100 years. The storm path wasn't the entrance. It was a trap that had opened, and now it had closed. I turned around. My escape was over. And then I saw them. They weren't on the street. They were on their porches, all of them, at 5:45 in the morning. They'd broken their own schedule. For me. They stood motionless with their brooms in hand, waiting for me. "Sir," Mrs. Robles' voice came from the inn's porch behind me. She hadn't shouted. She'd spoken in her monotone, but the town's silence had carried it to me. "It's not walking time," she said. I turned around, panic turned to rage. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. "Order," said the mechanic who stood on the porch across the way. His voice was the same calm baritone. "You are disorder." They began to descend from their porches, in unison. 30 people. They dropped their brooms. The sound of 30 wooden handles hitting wooden porch was one, and they began to walk toward me, slow, rhythmic, with their empty smiles. They weren't running, they weren't in a hurry. The procedure had changed. I started running, not toward the wall, toward the mechanic shop. It was my only hope. I heard their steps behind me. A clop, clop, clop synchronized on the cobblestones. I reached the shop and threw myself at the side door. It was locked. I hit the window glass with my elbow. The pain was sharp, but the glass broke. I stuck my hand in, feeling glass cutting my skin, opened the latch and went in. They were surrounding the shop. I heard their calm steps circling the building. They didn't try to enter. They stopped outside. And then a new sound began, a tapping, tap, tap, tap. They were hitting the shop's sheet metal walls, all at once. A slow, steady rhythm that made the metal vibrate. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of the wall clock. They were the clock. My car was there, dismantled. But next to it was the mechanic's old tow truck. It was my only chance. I jumped into the cab. The keys weren't there. I cursed. I looked at the steering column. I didn't need keys. My job had taught me many things, including how to hotwire an old vehicle. The banging on the walls grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. I ripped out the wires. The metal vibrated around me. I touched the wires together. There was a spark. The tow truck's engine coughed, then roared to life. The sound was glorious. It was a chaotic, dirty, human sound. It broke the rhythm. I heard a change outside. The pounding stopped. There was silence. I gunned it. The big garage door was closed. I didn't care. I put it in gear and released the clutch. The tow truck crashed into the metal door with a crash that was the sweetest music I'd heard. The door buckled, came off its rails, and fell into the street. I came out into the gray light, the engine roaring. They were there. The crowd. They hadn't moved aside. The door's impact had knocked down 2 of them, who lay on the ground, motionless, not like injured people, but like toppled mannequins. The others looked at me. Their smiles were gone, their faces were blank pages. I turned the tow truck toward the wall. It was my only way out. I accelerated down the main street. The residents stood still, their heads turning in synchrony as I passed, like a field of dead sunflowers. I headed for the cobblestone wall. It was solid. I accelerated. I hit the wall at 60 miles per hour. The impact was brutal. I was thrown against the wheel. The metal crunched. The tow truck stopped. But the wall had given way. It had cracked. I reversed, the engine screaming, and I hit it again. This time, a section of the wall collapsed, revealing the muddy road on the other side. I heard a sound behind me. It wasn't footsteps. It was a shriek. A high-pitched, multiple shriek like 1,000 insects. The hive was wounded. I didn't look back. I drove over the rubble and out onto the muddy road, skidding and fighting to keep control. I drove like a madman, the tow truck's engine protesting. I drove for an hour until the sun began to rise, until the engine overheated and died with a final hiss of steam. I got out of the tow truck. I was in the middle of nowhere on a mountain road I didn't know. I was covered in sweat, blood from the cut on my arm, and oil. I was alive. I started walking. The silence here was different. It was full of birds, of wind through the pines, of the sound of my own irregular, clumsy steps. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with chaotic free air. I'd seen the face of malignant perfection, a mechanism that tried to polish me into another piece of its clock. I survived not because I was stronger, but because I was broken, because I was human. And I knew I'd never again be bothered by being late to an appointment. Being messy was a gift. It was proof that I was still me. My life was defined by the smell of wood. I was the carpenter of the hollow, or at least I used to be. My workshop smells of pine and varnish, a smell that for me had always been synonymous with peace, honest work, and predictable days. Our town isn't a place you find by accident. It's tucked into the ribs of the mountains, a bowl of stone houses at the end of a road that dies there. We were 57 souls when it started. 57 people who knew the sound of each other's footsteps, who knew who was coming by the clearing of their throat before seeing their face. In the hollow, doors didn't have locks out of necessity, but out of habit. We never used them. The outside world was a distant rumor, something we saw on the only TV in Luis's bar, flickering with news from cities we couldn't imagine. Our trust was ancient, solid as the rock we built the town on, a blind trust forged by shared winters and voluntary isolation. We were a family, or so we believed. The day we found Don Arturo, that belief shattered. He was the town's memory, the old mailman who, even after retiring, walked the streets every morning bringing news and saying hello to everyone. He was a methodical man, his life a sundial. When he didn't show up at Luis's bar for his 8 o'clock coffee, there was unease. It wasn't worry at first. It was simple disorder. It was the first time in 20 years that Arturo had missed. The cup Luis poured him every morning sat on the bar, cooling. 3 of us went to find him. Luis wiping his hands on his apron, young Tomas, who tended the sheep, and me. His house was empty, the door open as always. The coffee pot sat on the cold burner, the coffee half consumed, still warm. The kitchen chair was pulled away from the table at an odd angle, as if he'd gotten up in a hurry. He wasn't in his garden. The atmosphere in the house was heavy, unnatural. Tomas was the one who spotted him. He pointed toward the forest, to the path Arturo took every day, rain or snow. And there, about 100 yards from town, under the father tree, the oldest oak that watched over the valley, he was. It wasn't an animal. Animals kill out of hunger with functional, messy violence. This was something else. This was order. It was a ritual. Don Arturo was kneeling, his knees on a carpet of moss placed just so, his back straight, his head bowed as if praying to the tree. The most terrible thing wasn't the wound which he had, a clean cut on the neck, but his hands. They were tied behind his back, not with rope. They were bound with a braid of wildflowers and wheat stalks. An impossible sailor's knot, complex and tight. It was a mockery of the crowns we made for the harvest festival. It was a message. Luis threw up. Tomas froze, his young eyes glassy with shock. I felt a chill that didn't come from the mountain air. It was the chill of intention. And I knew in that very instant that the hollow we knew, the one with open doors and blind trust, had died with him. Everything had broken. When we brought him back to town, wrapped in a blanket, panic was a contained wave. People gathered in the square. The mayor, Don Eladio, tried to calm everyone down. He insisted it must have been a poacher from the city, someone who got scared. But we all saw the braided flowers. No one from the city knew how to make those knots. No one from the city knew about Arturo's devotion to that tree. The fear wasn't just about the death, it was about betrayal. We looked at each other, searching for the flaw in a friend's face, the hint of madness that had been incubating for years right next to our fireplaces. Doubt was a plague. Which one of us had woken up that morning with that intention? We tried to call the police, but the sky, which had been gray all day, opened up. It started to snow. It wasn't the soft December snow. It was a blizzard, a white wall that swallowed the road, the valley, and the world. In 2 hours, the hollow was cut off. Phone lines died with a final groan of static. The only access road was now a white abyss. Nature had conspired with the killer to leave us alone. The mayor gathered us in the church. The only heat was a wood stove that smelled of resin. People huddled together, but the space between each of us had grown. We were no longer a community. We were a group of suspects. I watched Luis's hands, the hands that served coffee. I watched Tomas's hands, the ones that helped birth lambs. Any of those hands could have made those knots. Eladio said we'd wait, that the storm would pass, that the police would come. But his eyes kept drifting to the door. Distrust was a bitter smoke that stuck to our clothes. That first night was the longest of my life. I went to my workshop, next to my house. The smell of sawdust and glue, which had always calmed me, now offered no comfort. I heard the wind howling outside, a sound like a giant wolf. And for the first time in 30 years, I threw the bolt on my workshop, and then on my house. The sound of metal sliding into wood was the sound of our trust breaking. I looked out the window. The town was dark, snow covering everything. But I saw lights. Lights in houses that used to be dark. I saw silhouettes in my neighbors' windows. And they weren't watching me. They were watching each other's houses. Fear had settled in. And then I heard something else. A dry metallic sound, repeated, carried by the wind. It was the sound of other bolts. The one on Eladio's house. The one on Tomas's house. The entire town was locking its doors, one against the other. No one slept that night. The storm lasted 2 days. 2 days of howling wind and relentless snow. The town lost power. We moved like ghosts with flashlights and candles. Fear was tangible. It had become a smell, like rusted metal. People only gathered to get firewood or water from the well, in groups of 3 or 4, never alone. And conversations died. There were only whispers and furtive glances. Every axe used to chop wood was now a potential weapon. On the 3rd day, the snow stopped. The hollow was buried. We were in a white tomb. It was decided we needed to check on the elderly, especially Clara. Clara was the old blacksmith's widow. She lived alone in the last house, closest to the forest we now viewed with terror. She hadn't come for her rations at town hall. This time 5 of us went, armed with shovels and wood axes. Fear made us look like a mob. We had to dig to reach her door. Snow had piled against it, a wall almost 6 feet high. It took us an hour to tunnel through. But the door wasn't locked. It was open, just a crack. We found her in her kitchen. The killer hadn't wasted time during the storm. She was sitting at her own table, rigid. On the table, a cup of frozen tea. And in the cup, there wasn't tea. There was dirt. Her hands were in her lap. But this time the knot was different. They were bound with sewing thread, hundreds of loops of black thread like a perfect spider web. I watched Luis. His face was gray. I watched Tomas. He was crying silently. The mayor, Eladio, leaned against the doorframe. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." But it could be. The killer wasn't an outsider. There were no tracks in or out except ours. The storm hadn't protected us. It had locked us in. We were trapped under 15 feet of snow with something wearing the face of a friend, a neighbor, a brother. The ritual wasn't for the dead. It was for us. It was a message driving us insane. And the killer was there, among us, watching. The walk back was a slow procession. No one spoke. The snow, which had seemed like a protective wall before, was now the lid of our coffin. There were 5 of us who dug to Clara's house. Luis, Tomas, Eladio, a man named Jaime, and me. I studied each of them, noticing details that before were just features and now were possible clues. Luis's hands, strong and used to gripping things. Tomas's empty eyes, still crying. Eladio's pale face and forced calm. I felt deep nausea. The killer was among us, sharing our shovel and our fear. We reached the church, which now served as a meeting center and makeshift morgue. The news spread like poison. Town hall doors were locked, a useless symbolic act that only reminded us the danger wasn't outside, but inside those very walls. People refused to go to church. They locked themselves in their houses. Fear transformed into a brutal need to find logic. I spent the night in my workshop. The carpentry tools offered superficial comfort. I focused on the ritual. Don Arturo bound with flowers. Clara bound with sewing thread. The killer was meticulous, an artist of cruelty. The knots. The knots were the point. They were perfect. Sailor's knots or complex sewing knots. I, as a carpenter, knew binding knots, the tension of wood. But this was something else. Something learned. Something ancient. I snuck back into Don Arturo's house the next day. I needed to see the place without the crowd. The scene had been cleaned, but the mark in the moss was still there. I knelt and examined the father tree. I found a small strand, a fiber the killer had used to braid the flowers. It was a fiber that didn't grow in the mountains. It was rare, from an ornamental plant that only grew in the town's enclosed gardens. The killer hadn't killed on impulse. They'd planned. They'd gathered materials calmly. They'd brought death to their doorstep. I started watching my neighbors, not strangers, but the ones I knew. Who was too calm? Who had an enclosed garden? Paranoia devoured me. I saw Luis serving coffee with unreal calm. I saw Tomas digging his own path with frantic energy. I saw Eladio organizing rations with authority that felt hollow. And I realized that in this atmosphere of distrust, the killer didn't have to do anything. The community itself was self-destructing. I felt constant pressure, as if I were being watched. One afternoon, I left a carpenter's plane on my workshop bench, angled toward the window. When I came back from my house, the plane was straight, aligned with the edge. A subtle touch, a warning. The killer knew I was investigating, and they were telling me I was being watched too. By the fourth day of isolation, paranoia was total. People barely went out. Children were locked inside. The town was a mausoleum. Lack of sleep made the workshop shadows seem to move on their own. Every creak in the old wood was a sign someone was approaching, that someone had entered without me hearing. My own house had become a place of terror. I stopped lighting the stove so as not to leave a smoke trail that could guide anyone. My only companions were the ice and distrust. And then came the morning of the fifth day. Doña Juana hadn't shown up to collect her wood ration. Doña Juana, the old woman who'd run the post office before it closed years ago. She was a woman who lived in the center of town, her house surrounded by neighbors. And worse, Doña Juana was a security fanatic. She had 2 deadbolts on her door and she always used them. No one could have gotten in without her opening voluntarily. Several of us went to her house. We had to use an axe to force our way in. The door was locked from the inside, both deadbolts engaged. The scene broke all logic. We found Doña Juana sitting in her chair, facing the cold fireplace. She was dead. Positioned like Arturo and Clara, with that ritual composure. Her hands bound, this time with white shoelaces, in an intricate weaving knot I didn't recognize. But the house was sealed. The deadbolts were engaged from inside. There was no other visible exit. The killer had been inside with her, killed her, and left. But how? The only possible conclusion was that the killer was someone she knew, someone she let in, and who then sealed the house before leaving by means only they knew. But that was unthinkable in the hollow. Panic broke loose. People on the street started screaming. Glances became open accusations. Eladio lost control of the situation. He shouted that it was impossible. Tomas, seeing the scene, burst into tears and started screaming about the devil and black magic. I watched the crowd close in on itself. Someone pointed at Tomas. He was the youngest, the most emotional, the only one who'd screamed. People started surrounding him. His hysteria was the proof they were looking for. I stayed back. I knew it wasn't Tomas. Tomas didn't have the calm to make such elaborate knots, and the killer would never let themselves be seen that way. I went back into Doña Juana's house while the mob formed outside. I examined the shoelace knot. The pattern wasn't a sailor's knot. It was an embroidery knot used to finish delicate fabrics. It requires patience and precision that didn't fit anyone I knew in the hollow, except one person. I went to the back room, Doña Juana's sewing room. It was spotless. I found her thread drawer, and I saw something else. I found her old post office log from when the office still operated. It was full of cryptic notations. I knelt trying to decipher the symbols. They were dates, and next to each date a name, and next to the name a number, a house number, a pattern. I spent an hour there with the gray light coming through the window. The pattern wasn't simple, it wasn't random. I drew a mental map of the town on a paper I found. The numbers in Juana's log didn't follow the official house numbering, but their geometric position in town. The killer was murdering those who broke an invisible symmetry, those who were outside an imaginary circle. It was geometric madness. Don Arturo lived on a corner that broke the town's harmonious curve. Clara lived in a row of identical houses, but her house was the only one with a slight eastward tilt, built that way because of uneven ground. Doña Juana lived outside the central circle, in a house that had been added after the original founding. The killer wasn't murdering sinners. They were murdering those who didn't fit a perfect mental design. They were purging the town's imperfections, correcting what they considered architectural errors. And then, at the bottom of the drawer, I found an object that didn't belong to Doña Juana. It was a small piece of wood, an ebony block with notches used as a carving guide. One of my tools. One I'd missed the week before when I did a repair at Town Hall. I'd assumed I'd left it somewhere. I stood up, breathing shallow. The killer had stolen my tool and left it here deliberately. It was a signature, a challenge, a warning that I too was being watched, evaluated. And then I saw it clearly. It wasn't the mayor, it wasn't the bartender, it wasn't any man. The pattern, the symmetry, the embroidery, the enclosed gardens with ornamental flowers. There was only one person in the hollow who knew the tension of sewing knots, who understood geometry to the point of obsession, who valued order to the point of madness. A person who'd spent their entire life correcting, fixing, perfecting. I moved to the sewing room wall. There was an embroidered map there, a huge tapestry showing the hollow. I'd seen it 1,000 times. It was a work of art that the mayor's wife, Doña Irene, had donated to the church years ago. But when the church was modernized, Juana had claimed it to decorate her house. I studied it up close for the first time. The map didn't show the hollow as it was. It showed the hollow as it should be. A perfect circle of symmetrical houses. The houses of Arturo, Clara, and Juana were absent from the embroidery. They'd never existed in her perfect vision. I turned toward the street. The uproar around Tomas was a blur of noise and confusion. I knew the mob would kill him before they realized their mistake. And the killer was right there among the crowd watching their work. The mayor's wife, Irene, the woman who made the town's best embroidery, who always had the most perfect flowers in her window, who'd lived her entire life in an immaculate house without a single object out of place, who'd been born here when the hollow was even smaller, purer, more symmetrical. Urgency hit like a punch to the gut. I knew that every passing second the mob was closer to committing the worst mistake of its history. I had to save Tomas. I ran out of Doña Juana's house with the coded log in one hand and the small ebony block in the other. The frozen air hit me. The gray morning light, which should have brought relief, only revealed the madness. I ran toward the mob in the square. The community's fear had condensed into a violent, noisy mass, a blind animal seeking a sacrificial victim. I found Tomas cornered against the church wall. Luis and Eladio were trying to hold people back, but the hysteria was too strong. People were shouting at Tomas, not with words, but with sounds of pure accusation. I pushed through. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice raw with disbelief and effort. No one heard me. I threw myself at the circle, hitting 2 men with my body. I reached Tomas, who'd given up, his body shaking, his eyes closed. "The killer isn't him," I shouted. "You're all wrong." The crowd stopped. The silence was immediate and unnatural. Eladio looked at me, his face white, not understanding. "Manuel, what are you talking about? Tomas has lost it." "Tomas is innocent. I've been at Juana's house. The killer is someone who loved symmetry, someone who couldn't stand disorder." I moved to the center of the crowd, holding up the log. The knots on the dead aren't hunter's knots or sailor's knots. They're embroidery knots. And I know because I've cracked the pattern. People watched me with distrust. The carpenter talking about embroidery. "Juana's post office log isn't just numbers," I explained, my voice gaining strength. "It's a map. The killer didn't murder sinners. They murdered those who broke the line. The houses marked in this log follow a code, a pattern seeking absolute symmetry in our town's geometry. Arturo was on the corner that broke the circle. Clara lived in the only tilted house in the block. Juana lived outside the original perimeter. The killer was correcting the town's geometry, seeking symmetry, malignant perfection. My accusation hung in the air, frozen and logical. That's when I saw her. Eladio's wife, Doña Irene. She stood at the church door, watching everything with an absolute calm more disturbing than the mob's screaming. She wore a gray wool coat and her hands were folded peacefully. Her eyes met mine. The expression on her face wasn't surprise, it was understanding. A frozen acceptance that her pattern had been discovered. Eladio, the mayor, looked at me, then at his wife. "Irene, what is this man talking about? Manuel's gone crazy from the storm." "I've gone crazy from seeking order," I said, not taking my eyes off Irene, and she understands that better than anyone. The crowd hesitated. Irene took a step forward, her composure intact. "Manuel," she said, her voice sweet, a subtle poison. "You've always been a man of right angles, a man who prefers wood to people. Isn't that right? Always alone in your workshop. And now you come to blame me, the mayor's wife, the one who takes care of this town, for your madness." She turned to the crowd. "Look at him, he's obsessed. He's been locked up, smelling his varnishes, going crazy from isolation. Just like Clara, just like Arturo. He's the one who doesn't fit the pattern. He's the disorder. He's lying to save the boy." The crowd shifted. Irene's logic was perverse and brilliant. It was my word against hers, and she was symmetry, perfection. I was the hermit, the crazy carpenter. Luis looked at me, doubt in his eyes. "Manuel, she's right. You've been strange." "Strange, yes," I shouted, desperate. "Strange for not being blind. Strange for seeing what you don't want to see." I held up the ebony block. "This, my own tool. She left it at Juana's house. A signature." "She stole it from my workshop when I did repairs at Town Hall last week. It's her game. She's playing with all of us." "The ebony block," Irene said with disdain. "You must have dropped it yourself. Your hands are dirty with sawdust. You're shaking." "The passageway," I shouted, my last card. "She got in through a tunnel, the one connecting the founding houses, the old basements built last century, when the hollow was just 7 houses. It's in Juana's room behind the embroidered map she made herself. The map she donated to the church and then had Juana claim. She embroidered it to seal the entrance, to hide her path." Eladio, his face broken, didn't look at his wife. He looked toward Juana's house. "The old basements?" he whispered. "My grandfather told me about them. Said the 7 founding houses were connected, but they were sealed when..." He stopped and ran. This time the crowd wasn't a mob. It was a wave of contained horror following him. Luis, Jaime, me, we all ran. I had to see the end of this. We left Tomas and Irene alone in the square, in unbearable tension. We burst into the house. Eladio reached the back room. The embroidered map hung on the wall. It was a work of art, every stitch millimeter perfect, showing the hollow as a symmetrical paradise that didn't exist. Eladio didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy wooden frame's edge and pulled. The fabric tore, but the frame moved, turning on hidden hinges that I, the carpenter who'd repaired half the town's houses, had never noticed. Behind the map there was no wall. There was a hole, A pit of absolute darkness. A smell of dead earth, mice and abandonment came from the tunnel. A fetid breath of the town's hidden history. People stepped back, choking on screams. It was real. The passageway was real. Eladio turned on his flashlight. The beam disappeared into the blackness. But on the floor, right at the entrance, there was something. White shoelaces, identical to the ones binding Juana, and next to them, the blade. Eladio picked it up. A small embroidery blade with a carved bone handle and dried stains. The walk back to the square was the longest of our lives. No one ran. We walked in procession. Eladio led, not as a mayor, but as a man carrying proof of his own destruction. Irina remained where we'd left her, by the church, as calm as a marble statue. Eladio stopped in front of her. He said nothing. He just opened his hand and dropped the blade in the snow at her feet. In that moment, symmetry broke. Her immaculate face contorted not in fear but in frozen, pure fury. The fury of an artist whose masterwork had been ruined by a misplaced piece of wood. They were out of place, Irene said, her voice now different. Arturo with his house on that horrible corner. Clara with that grotesque tilt. Juana in her added-on house. I just tried to return the town to its perfection, to what it was before. Eladio grabbed her. She didn't resist. The game was over. The sun began to peek over the mountains, melting the snow, opening the road. We knew the police would arrive. We knew the nightmare would end. But no one moved. The emptiness that fell over the square was different from the snows. It wasn't an emptiness of peace. It was an emptiness of shame and horror. I watched my neighbors' faces. Luis, Tomas, Eladio. They were no longer my neighbors. They were a group of strangers who'd nearly killed each other. The hollow hadn't died from Irene's murders. It had died the instant the first bolt clicked, the moment my hand closed around the axe to visit Clara. Irene had only been the hand that exposed the rot we already had inside. The ritual of symmetry had been broken, but the ritual of distrust, of suspicion that had just been born, and that would never be erased. When the police arrived that afternoon, they took Irene away. In the following weeks, half the town left. Luis closed the bar. Tomas left without saying goodbye. I stayed. My workshop still smelled of pine and varnish, but it was no longer synonymous with peace. The hollow is still here in the ribs of the mountains. But we're no longer 57 souls, we're 22. 22 people living with locked doors, with bolts thrown, with glances that never quite meet. Trust once broken doesn't get repaired. Not with wood, not with words, not with time, and that's what keeps me awake every night. The cabin was little more than 4 walls of rough wood and a roof, but it was exactly what I needed. It was nestled in the heart of a forest so dense and ancient that sunlight reached the ground filtered and tinged with green. To get here, I had driven for 6 hours, the last 2 along a dirt track that seemed more like a suggestion than a drivable road. The real estate agent had handed me the keys with a look of pity, asking no questions. People who seek this kind of isolation rarely do so for happy reasons. I was no exception. I was looking for silence, a silence so absolute it would allow me to hear the roar of my own grief without distractions, with the vain hope that if I let it scream freely, it would eventually exhaust itself. The first few days were a blur of stillness and apathy. I barely unpacked. I slept. I walked aimlessly among the trees until the cold forced me back, and I spent hours sitting on the porch watching the shadows lengthen and swallow the forest. The silence was total, deeper than anything I had ever experienced. There were no birds, no distant highway noise, no drone of an airplane in the sky, only the wind, whispering in the treetops with the cadence of a distant tide. The silence I had craved became my only companion, a void that perfectly reflected the one she had left inside me. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it without a second thought. It was one night while I watched the flames dance in the small iron fireplace. I thought I heard, very far away, the tinkling of a small wind chime. It was a specific sound, a melody of 5 metallic, slightly dissonant notes. The same one she had hung in our kitchen window, the one the wind rang every morning. I got up and went out to the porch. The air was cold and still. Not a single leaf was moving. There was no wind. There was no wind chime. It was my mind, I told myself. An echo of memory, an auditory hallucination triggered by pain and loneliness. I went back inside and closed the door harder than necessary. A couple of nights later, it happened again. I was trying to read, though the words refused to form coherent sentences in my head. Then, over the crackling of the fire, a different sound arrived. It was a humming, a soft, almost inaudible melody, sung in a slightly off-key tone that was painfully familiar. It was the song she always hummed when she cooked, an old folk tune whose lyrics she could never quite remember. The sound was incredibly crisp despite its low volume. It seemed to come from somewhere between the trees just beyond the small clearing where the cabin sat. This time I couldn't dismiss it so easily. I put down the book and went to the window, trying to see something in the impenetrable darkness. The humming continued for almost a minute, an intimate and ghostly serenade, before fading into silence. My heart beat with a mixture of terror and a hope so terrible it shamed me. Was I going crazy? Was this the next step in the grieving process, the fabrication of comforts the mind creates to protect itself from unbearable pain? I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, listening, waiting, but the forest remained silent. The real terror began a week after my arrival. I had managed to sleep a few hours and woke up in the middle of the night. The cabin was freezing. I got up to add more wood to the fire, which had been reduced to dying embers. As I approached the fireplace, I heard it. It wasn't a tinkle or a hum, it was a word, my name. It was a whisper, not a shout. Soft, intimate, spoken with her voice. The inflection, the slight pause before the last syllable, the way her breath seemed to run out at the end. It was her. It was her voice, just as I remembered it from the thousands of times she had called me from the other room of our house. The sound came from outside, right on the other side of the front door. I froze, a log halfway to the fire. Time seemed to stop. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was impossible, a betrayal of my own senses. But the perfection of the imitation was absolute. It was more real than any memory. I waited, holding my breath, but it didn't repeat. Only silence, now charged with a new and terrible expectation. I didn't go back to bed. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair with my back to the door, like a child hiding from monsters waiting for dawn. From that night on, the battle began. During the day, logic prevailed. The forest was full of animals. The wind could create strange acoustics, and my mind was undoubtedly in a fragile state. I rationalized, I looked for explanations, I clung to sanity with all my might. I told myself it was the ghosts in my own head tormenting me, not those of the forest. But when the sun went down and darkness swallowed the world, logic shrank to a trembling point of light, and fear and hope took control. The voices became more frequent but never predictable. Sometimes nights would pass in silence, lulling me into a false sense of security, and then they would return with a new cruelty. One night I heard the sound of her laugh, that guttural, contagious sound I loved so much, coming from the bank of the nearby stream. Another night, I heard the soft whimpering of our dog, who had died a year before her. Each sound was a key opening a wound, a piece of artillery custom-made for my soul. I realized something was studying me. Something had dug into the depths of my grief and was pulling out my most cherished and painful memories to use against me. It wasn't an aimless ghost. It was a hunter, and its bait was my own past. The internal struggle became excruciating. Part of me knew I had to flee that cabin, that cursed forest. But another part, the part that missed her with a consuming intensity, wanted to stay, wanted to hear her, even if it was a lie. It was the only thing I had left of her. The impulse to run out into the darkness every time I heard her voice was almost unbearable. I clung to the doorframe, knuckles white, reminding myself that what was out there wasn't her, but something terrible wearing her sonic skin. One night, while a fine rain tapped against the roof, the entity made its boldest move. I was sitting by the fire, physically and mentally exhausted. The forest had been silent for 2 days, and I had almost convinced myself the worst was over. Then I heard her speak. Not a whisper, not a single word. It was a complete sentence, crystal clear, spoken right on the other side of the window. "Do you remember the sandstorm?" A chill ran from head to toe. It was a meaningless phrase to anyone else, but to me it was everything. It referred to a vacation we had taken years ago, a private anecdote, an absurd and happy moment that was ours alone, a secret. The sound of that question, of that memory ripped from my heart and spoken with her voice, was too much. The dam of my self-control broke. Tears I hadn't been able to shed for months welled up in my eyes. And with them, the last of my defenses came crashing down. The pain and the need to believe outweighed the fear. I stood up, trembling, and walked toward the door. I didn't care anymore if it was a trap. If there was a chance, however remote, to feel her close again, I was willing to take the risk. My hand, shaking, closed over the cold metal of the doorknob. Outside, in the darkness, only the sound of the rain could be heard. Waiting. My hand turned the doorknob. The cold metal was the only real sensation in a world that had dissolved into memory and longing. I pushed the door open and the smell of wet earth and pine hit me hard. The fine rain fell like a veil over the darkness, plating the nearby ferns in silver. I stepped out onto the porch barefoot, not caring about the cold of the wet wood beneath my feet. The forest was silent. The voice was gone. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling like a complete idiot the instant the word left my lips. My voice sounded weak, pathetic, immediately absorbed by the vastness of the night. I waited, rainwater running down my face, mixing with my tears. I waited for the voice to return, to give me another crumb of its perfect imitation. But there was no answer, just the constant patter of rain on the roof and the whisper of the wind, which now sounded hollow and mocking. The invitation had been extended, and in my hesitation I had lost it. I stood out there for almost an hour, shivering from cold and a disappointment so bitter it burned my throat, until reality set in with crushing cruelty. I was alone. I always had been. I went back inside, closed the door, and slid the bolt, a useless gesture against an enemy that didn't need to open doors. I felt more broken than ever. The entity, whatever it was, had found my breaking point and pressed it with surgical precision. It had turned hope into a new form of torture. For the next few days, the forest remained silent, but the absence of the voices was now almost worse than their presence. Every crack of a branch, every hoot of a distant owl, put me on high alert, waiting, almost wishing, to hear her again. The enemy had changed tactics. It had shown me what it could offer and then snatched it away, leaving me in a state of auditory withdrawal. I realized I spent the entire day listening, tense, unable to focus on anything else. I had ceased to be a grieving man and had become a prisoner awaiting his jailer's next visit. And then, the ghost strategy changed again in a much more perverse way. It stopped calling me from the forest. It started speaking from inside the cabin. The first time was mid-afternoon. I was sitting in the old armchair staring at the fire when I heard a soft sigh coming from the dark corner of the bedroom. It was unmistakable. It was the sigh she let out when she was tired, a sound half exhaustion, half satisfaction. I spun around, my heart clenched in a fist. The room was empty and dim, but the sound had been there, so close, so real. It was no longer a distant echo brought by the wind. It was with me, inside my shelter. From then on, the cabin walls ceased to be a defense. They became the resonance chamber of my torment. I heard the sound of her soft footsteps on the wooden hallway floor while I was in the kitchen. I heard the rustle of her dress fabric as she passed my chair. One night while I tried to sleep, I heard the slight creak on the other side of the mattress, as if she had just lain down beside me. I didn't open my eyes. I lay motionless, paralyzed by a terror so intimate and deep it stole my breath. I felt a presence beside me, an imaginary warmth, the weight of a body that wasn't there. My sanity began to fray. The line between memory, hallucination, and manifestation became non-existent. I started talking to her, at first in whispers. "What do you want from me?" I asked the still air of the cabin. Sometimes it answered. Not with sentences, but with more sounds. If I asked with anger, I heard her stifled weeping from the bedroom. If I asked with desperation, I heard her soothing humming from the kitchen. It was playing with me, using a repertoire of her most characteristic sounds to manipulate my emotions, to keep me hooked in a one-way dialogue. In a strange moment of clarity, while holding the only photograph I had brought with me, a picture of the two of us smiling on a beach, I understood. I saw her smiling face, and then looked at the empty, oppressive cabin surrounding me. I understood the true nature of the trap. The entity didn't want to kill me. It didn't want to drag me into the woods to devour me. It wanted something far worse. It wanted me to stay. It fed on my pain, on my longing, on my constant remembrance. My grief was its sustenance. And to ensure an eternal supply, it had turned the cabin into a perfect simulation of a life with her. It offered me a golden cage, a sanctuary of echoes where I would never have to be truly alone. The horror wasn't that it wanted to end my life, but that it wanted my life to become that forever. A man sitting in a cabin listening to a ghost, living in a manufactured past until grief finally consumed me completely. And with that revelation, I saw the choice before me, as clear and sharp as a shard of broken glass. I could give up. I could accept that phantom reality. I could stay and live the rest of my days in that sweet and poisonous company, becoming the guardian of the shrine of my own grief. Or I could fight. But fighting a ghost made of my own memories wasn't something that could be done with a weapon or with courage. There was only one way to kill it. I had to starve it. I had to rip out the pain it fed on. I had to stop remembering. I made my decision that very night. It was the hardest thing I would ever have to do. It was a betrayal of everything we had been. I knelt in front of the fireplace, photograph in hand. I looked at it one last time, memorizing every detail of her smile. "I forgive you for leaving me," I whispered to the fire. "And now you have to forgive me." I brought the photo closer to the flames. The instant the paper began to curl from the heat, the cabin filled with her voice, now loud, clear, desperate. "No, don't do it, please!" she screamed from every corner at once. It was her voice, but charged with an anguish I had never heard in life. I let the corner of the photo catch fire. The image of her face began to darken, to disappear. "Don't forget me. I love you. Don't leave me alone again," the voice pleaded, turning into a heartbreaking wail. Tears ran down my face, but I didn't pull my hand away. I held the photo until the fire consumed her face and only a piece of black ash remained in my fingers. The weeping turned into a scream of rage and pain that made the cabin walls vibrate. I grabbed the only sweater of hers I had kept, the one that still held a trace of her perfume, and threw it into the fire too. With every memory I offered to the flames, with every piece of our past I turned into smoke, the ghost's voice became weaker, more distant, like a radio losing signal. I spent the whole night like that, in a brutal exorcism against myself. I didn't burn any more objects, but I sat in front of the fire and, one by one, brought my most cherished memories to mind and let them go. The first time we met, our first kiss, our wedding day, lazy Sunday mornings. Each memory I let go was a stab in my own heart, and with each stab the ghost faded a little more. By dawn the cabin was silent. A different silence. It was no longer expectant or oppressive. It was an empty, absolute silence. The ghost was gone. I had killed it. I had starved it to death. I sat there staring at the gray ashes in the fireplace. I had won. I was safe. But the price of my survival had been my soul. To escape the ghost, I had been forced to murder my own past, to burn the memories that defined me. The silence that now surrounded me was no longer the refuge I sought when I arrived. It was the silence of the void. I was alone, in a way far deeper and more terrible than I had ever imagined. My loneliness was a physical condition. I felt it as a weight in my chest, as a constant cold under my skin. I lived in the heart of a city with millions of souls, and yet I was invisible. My days were a succession of empty interactions and silences in an apartment that felt more like a tomb than a home. I longed for connection, the simple and fundamental feeling of being part of something, of my existence resonating in someone else's. It was a thirst so deep I was willing to drink from any source, no matter how strange. I didn't find the nexus through a flashy ad, but through a small, thick paper pamphlet someone had left on a coffee shop table. It didn't promise salvation or answers. It offered only one thing, written in simple, elegant lettering: the cure for isolation. Below it, an address. It was an unremarkable building in an industrial neighborhood, a former textile factory converted into something else, with no sign on the outside revealing what it housed. I walked in with my heart tightened by a mix of hope and skepticism. The interior was a surprising oasis of calm. The ceilings were high, the exposed brick walls were painted a warm white, and light filtered through enormous windows. The air smelled of sandalwood and herbal tea. About 30 people moved through the common space with a serenity and purpose that felt strangely appealing. They greeted me with genuine smiles, without asking intrusive questions. They offered me a place to sit, a cup of tea, and let me simply be, observe. For the first time in years, I didn't feel judged. I felt simply accepted. The members of the commune, who referred to themselves as a family, were a mix of people of all ages. They spoke softly, moved with a fluid grace, and had a certain intensity in their gaze when they looked at you. Total attention that was both comforting and slightly overwhelming. The leader, if he could be called that, was a middle-aged man named Elian. He didn't preach or give speeches. His presence was silent but magnetic. He sat with the others, took part in the daily tasks, and watched everyone with empathy so strong it almost felt tangible. I decided to stay. The first week was a revelation. I took part in daily chores, tending the hydroponic rooftop garden, cooking in the communal kitchen, keeping the spaces clean. Everything was done with a silent, fluid cooperation that was astonishing. No one gave orders. Everyone seemed to know exactly what to do, like a school of fish moving in unison. And at the center of everything was the connection session. They invited me to join on my third day. They explained it was the heart of the nexus, the ritual that kept them united. They led me to a circular room in the center of the building. The walls were made of smooth, dark stone, and the only light came from thin, glowing strips on the floor that gave off a soft amber glow. In the center of the room, on a low stone pedestal, was the artifact. It wasn't a machine. It looked organic, alive. It resembled a large geode, about 1 meter in diameter, but its surface wasn't crystal. It was smooth, pale nacre with iridescent veins that shifted slowly beneath the surface. The top of the sphere was covered in soft, perfectly contoured indentations the size of a human palm. We sat in a circle around the pedestal. There were about 20 of us. Elian made a small gesture, and one by one we stepped forward and placed a hand in one of the indentations. I mimicked the others, my heart beating with a mix of fear and anticipation. The artifact's surface was cold to the touch, but not like stone, an organic cold, like the skin of an amphibian. And beneath my palm I felt a very subtle vibration, like the faint purr of a sleeping animal. I closed my eyes as the others did. For a minute nothing happened, only silence and the cold beneath my hand. And then it began. It wasn't a vision or a sound. It was a surge of pure sensation. My mind, my consciousness was ripped from my body and submerged in an ocean of experiences that weren't mine. I felt morning sunlight on a face that wasn't mine, the bittersweet taste of an orange in a mouth that wasn't mine. I felt the stabbing pain in the arthritic knee of an old man, followed by the explosive joy of a child receiving a gift. A torrent of memories and emotions flooded through me. The bitterness of a heartbreak, the satisfaction of a job well done, the fear of the dark in a childhood memory, the serene happiness of watching a sunset. They were fragments, flashes, thousands of lives lived in a single instant. Overwhelming, chaotic, but incredibly beautiful. It was the ultimate connection, absolute empathy. I felt the joy and pain of everyone in that room, and they felt mine. My loneliness dissolved in that collective torrent. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone. When the session ended and we withdrew our hands, I felt euphoric and completely exhausted, as if I had lived 100 lives in 10 minutes. My companions smiled at me, and this time their smiles didn't seem strange. There was a new understanding in their eyes. They had seen me, truly. I returned to my small, simple room in the commune feeling lighter than ever. The weight of my solitary existence seemed to have lifted, spread across the others. I lay on the bed, feeling a peace I couldn't remember ever having felt. And that was when the real horror began. I was thirsty. I got up and poured myself a glass of water from the tap. The water was fresh and clean. But as I raised the glass to my lips before the liquid even touched my tongue, my mouth filled with the unmistakable taste of black coffee, strong and bitter. It was so real I coughed, startled, spilling some water. The phantom taste lasted a few seconds, then faded, leaving only water. I froze, glass in hand. I sat on the bed, trying to make sense of it. A side effect, a residual hallucination from the ritual. It had to be that. I looked at my hands to steady myself, and for an instant, they weren't my hands. I saw them wrinkled, age-spotted, with thickened nails. I blinked and they were mine again, young and unmarked. A cold panic crawled up my spine. I stood and started pacing the room to clear my head. Suddenly, a sharp stabbing pain shot through my left shoulder, so intense it made me gasp. I grabbed the shoulder, expecting to find an injury, but there was nothing. The pain vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. The euphoria of connection had transformed into icy fear. The session hadn't ended. The nexus wasn't a temporary state accessed in that room. It was a permanent connection. The door I had opened refused to close. My mind was no longer private. It had become a badly tuned radio, picking up fragments of other people's broadcasts, someone else's coffee, someone else's hands, someone else's shoulder pain. I sat with my head in my hands, trying to separate my own thoughts from the noise. Impossible. I felt a wave of anxiety that wasn't mine, followed by deep sleepiness. I was feeling everyone all at once, a choir of phantom sensations threatening to drown my own consciousness. The cure for my loneliness was 1,000 times more terrifying than the illness itself. I had craved connection, and now I was trapped in it, a prisoner without walls in a prison made of other lives. The next 24 hours were hell. I tried isolating myself in my room, but the walls offered no protection. The connection was wireless, an invisible network my brain was permanently subscribed to with no way to unsubscribe. I felt the sharp migraine of a woman on the second floor, the sudden nicotine rush of a man secretly smoking in the garden, the dull frustration of someone trying to solve a crossword. My own mind was a crowded room full of whispers and shoves from other people's lives. Sleep wasn't escape, it was immersion. I no longer dreamed my own dreams. I dreamed of a little girl's first day of school, her fear and excitement as vivid as if they were mine. I dreamed of an old man saying goodbye to his wife in a hospital bed, and the grief tore through me with a violence my real life had never inflicted. I woke with my face wet with foreign tears, the echo of someone else's pain ringing in my chest. My own memories felt more distant, buried under layers of experiences that weren't mine. I decided to flee. The only logical reaction left. In a moment of relative psychic calm, I packed a small backpack with essentials, got dressed, and walked out of my room. I moved down the hall, trying to look as serene as the others. Every smile I received now felt like the empty smile of a jailer. As I passed Elian in the main hall, he looked up from a book and gave me one of his calm, empathetic looks. I felt a wave of calm that wasn't mine, a silent suggestion urging me to stay. I fought it and kept walking. I left the building. The cold city air hit my face, and for an instant I felt free. I walked without direction deep into the maze of streets, but the connection didn't break. 3 blocks away, I tasted the bitter herbal tea someone was drinking in the commune. 10 blocks away, I felt a burst of joy when one of the women found a rare flower in the garden. Distance didn't matter. The network had unlimited reach. There was no physical escape. Defeated, I returned to the commune. It was the only place where my state, though horrible, was normal. My only hope was to understand the source, the center of the network, and that center was Elian. I began to watch him not as a disciple but as a prisoner studying his warden. I noticed his strange immunity. While sometimes the rest of us experience collective emotions, a synchronized sigh, a phantom laugh, Elian remained impassive, an anchor of calm in the ocean of sensations. And I noticed something else. The strongest waves of emotion seemed to come from him. If he enjoyed a meal, a ripple of pleasure spread through the network. If he frowned at a book, a current of intellectual frustration brushed all of us. We weren't a democracy of feelings. We were a monarchy. The true nature of the network revealed itself to me one night during a connection session. I approached the Naker-sphere with a new purpose. I wasn't going to open myself to the network. I was going to use it to reach its center. I placed my hand on the cold surface and, instead of letting myself be swept away, I focused every bit of will I had left on one goal. Elian. It felt like swimming against a current. I felt the resistance of other minds, fragments of their lives crashing against me, but I kept pushing, searching for the nexus of all connections. And I found it. It wasn't an ocean, it was a web. And at its center, spinning the threads, was him. And I saw the truth. I saw Elian not as a benevolent guide, but as a creature of infinite loneliness and hunger. I saw how he had discovered the artifact, or created it, not to heal isolation, but to feed on the experiences he lacked. He didn't share our sensations, he consumed them. He lived through us, he tasted our meals, felt our loves, cried our sorrows, laughed our joys. We were his personal library of human experience, and he spent his days reading our souls. And as he read them, the pages went blank. The peace we felt wasn't serenity, it was emptiness. It was the result of being drained, leaving behind obedient, smiling shells whose only purpose was to go out into the world and feel new things for him to devour. The horror of that revelation almost disconnected me. I was in a soul farm and Elian was the farmer. My destiny wasn't connection, it was annihilation, being digested by his consciousness until nothing of me remained but a faint memory in his endless mind. I yanked my hand away from the artifact as if it burned. I opened my eyes. Everyone else was still in their trance, but Elian's eyes were open, and he was looking at me. His serene smile was gone. His face was a mask of cold neutrality, but his eyes were not a man's. They were ancient, deep, and in them I saw insatiable hunger. And I saw that he had seen me. He knew that I knew. I left the ritual hall, legs trembling. Over the next days, the pressure in my mind changed. It was no longer a chaotic choir of sensations. It was now a directed pulse, a single force pushing against the walls of my consciousness. It was Elian. He was trying to break down my defenses, to accelerate the process, to absorb me before I could do anything. I felt him attacking my memories, trying to tear away my childhood, my name, my face. The final confrontation happened in the same place, in the artifact room. I walked in and he was there alone, standing beside the Naker stone. The air trembled with power. We didn't speak. There was no need for such a primitive language. The battle was fought in silence on the plane of consciousness. I felt his mind crash into mine, immense, trying to dissolve me. I held on to my identity with the desperation of a drowning man. I focused on my pain, on my loneliness, on the very grief that had brought me here. It was all I had left, the proof that I had lived. It was my anchor. He struck back, flooding me with the empty peace of the others, the seductive promise of nothingness, of an end to suffering. For a moment I wavered. The idea of surrendering, of ceasing the fight, was incredibly tempting. But then I remembered the feeling of the sun on a stranger's face, the taste of someone else's coffee, and I felt a surge of rage. My life, imperfect and painful as it was, belonged to me. I gathered everything I was into a single act of rejection. I didn't attack him. I simply disconnected. I cut the thread that tied me to the nexus, the thread that tied me to him. It was the most painful thing I had ever done. It felt like tearing out part of my own brain. A silent scream ripped through my mind, and I collapsed to my knees exhausted. When I looked up, Elian was still there, but he no longer cared. His face was serene once more. The thread I had occupied in his web was now empty, and his attention had already moved on. To him, I no longer existed. I left the commune that same night. No one tried to stop me. To them, I was already a ghost. I walked through the city streets, and for the first time, the silence in my mind was absolute. No foreign sensations, no borrowed memories. But there wasn't much else either. The nexus, in tearing itself out of me, had taken pieces of me with it. My mind felt full of holes, of voids where something had once been. I had come seeking a cure for loneliness and disconnection, and I found the ultimate connection, total empathy, only to discover it was the most refined form of annihilation. I freed myself, but I am emptier than before. Now when I walk among the crowds, I no longer feel invisible. I feel the holes inside me, the spaces once filled with other lives. I've learned that loneliness isn't the worst prison. The worst is a crowded cell where none of the voices are your own. And sometimes in the silence of my apartment, a phantom taste still hits me, the echo of an echo, and I wonder if I will ever be truly alone again. I knew something was wrong because of the way I woke up. It wasn't the jolt from a nightmare or the grogginess of a short night. It was a heavy, profound exhaustion, as if my bones were filled with lead. I would go to bed feeling reasonably fine, after a normal day of work at the office and a quiet dinner, and I would open my eyes in the morning with the feeling of having run a marathon. My muscles ached with a dull fatigue, my eyelids were heavy, and the energy to start the day simply wasn't there. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Life in the city is demanding. My job was monotonous but constant, and I assumed my body was just asking me for a break I wasn't giving it. I tried the usual solutions, going to bed earlier, drinking relaxing teas, avoiding screens before sleep. Nothing worked. The morning exhaustion persisted, a thick fog that took me hours to dispel each day, leaving me in a state of perpetual irritability and distraction. Then I started to notice the small anomalies, details that were easy to dismiss on their own, but together began to paint a disturbing picture. One morning, getting up, I saw a bit of dried mud on the hardwood floor, right next to my bed. It was strange because it hadn't rained in weeks and I didn't remember walking through any dirt. I cleaned it up, perplexed, and thought no more of it. A few days later, I woke up with a long, thin scratch on my forearm. It wasn't deep, but it was there, a defined red line on my skin. I didn't remember getting it. I had no pets, and there was nothing in my bed that could have scratched me like that. Another morning, I was awakened by a strange smell in the room, a metallic ozone-like smell, like the air after a strong thunderstorm. As soon as I opened the window, the smell vanished completely. I began to feel a pang of unease. Fatigue was one thing, but physical evidence was another. The most logical, though disturbing idea was that I was doing something at night. Sleepwalking. I had never been a sleepwalker in my life, not even as a child, but it seemed the only plausible explanation. The idea of my body moving around the apartment without my consent was deeply unsettling. What was I doing? Where was I going? I decided to take precautions. I started locking my bedroom door from the inside. It was an old lock, one of those that use a skeleton key, but it was secure. If I left the room, I would have to unlock it, and surely the noise would wake me up. The next morning, I woke up feeling just as exhausted. The door was still locked with the key on the inside. But on the rug, next to the bed, there was a dry oak leaf. It was intact, as if it had just fallen from a tree. My unease turned into a cold fear. If I wasn't leaving the room, how were these things getting in? The fear of the unknown is worse than any certainty, no matter how terrible. I needed answers. I decided I had to see myself, to witness my own nighttime actions. The idea of buying a camera lingered in my mind for days. I felt paranoid, like one of those characters in movies who start to lose touch with reality. But the need to know was stronger than the embarrassment. I went to an electronics store and bought a small digital camera, the kind used to monitor babies or pets. It had night vision and could record for hours. That night, I placed it on the dresser, in a corner of the room after spending almost half an hour adjusting the angle to make sure the lens was pointed directly at my bed and covered most of the room, including the door and the main wall. I felt equal parts ridiculous and terrified. I got into bed, aware of the small red light of the camera watching me in the darkness. It took me a long time to fall asleep, but finally, exhaustion overcame me. The next morning, I woke with a sense of dread and anticipation. The first thing I did was look around. Nothing was out of place. No mud, no leaves. I got up, turned off the camera, and plugged the memory card into my computer. I sat down with a cup of coffee, my hands trembling slightly. Before hitting play, I hesitated. A part of me wanted to throw the card in the trash and live in ignorance, but it was too late for that. I took a deep breath and started the playback. The first few hours of recording were incredibly boring. I saw myself sleeping, turning over in bed, a black and white image of absolute stillness. I looked at the recording's timestamp. 1 in the morning, 2, 3, and then, at 3:03 exactly, something happened. My sleeping self sat up in bed. It did so with a fluid movement, not like someone waking up, but like a puppet having its strings pulled. His eyes were open but expressionless, glassy, and fixed on an invisible point. He got out of bed and started walking, but he didn't head for the door, which was still locked. He walked directly toward the smooth wall opposite the bed, the wall that separated my bedroom from the building's structural void. He walked without hesitation, with a determination that chilled my blood. I braced for the impact, the sound of my body hitting the plaster. But there was none. My nighttime self reached the wall, raised a hand, and rested it on the surface. And then he just kept walking. He walked through the wall. He sank into it as if it were a curtain of smoke without making the slightest sound. For a second, I saw the silhouette of his back sinking into the plaster, and then he disappeared completely. In the instant his body vanished, the camera's image turned to pure static, a deafening white noise. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I had just seen. I rewound the video and played it again. The same sequence. Me getting up, walking, passing through the solid wall. The static. I fast-forwarded the video. The static lasted for hours. Then, at 5:42, the image returned. And the first thing it recorded was my own figure walking out of the same wall, walking backward, as if emerging from nothing. He walked to the bed, lay down, and became still. The recording continued normally until I woke up. I got out of the chair and walked over to the wall. It was solid, cold, and real. I knocked on it with my knuckles. The sound was dull, definitive. It was a concrete and plaster wall. There was no secret door, no passageway. What I had seen was impossible. But the recording was there. Irrefutable proof that every night, my body left me to travel to a place on the other side of reality. I continued to record every night, and every night the routine was the same. At 3:03, I would get up and walk through the wall. The camera would fill with static, and shortly before dawn, I would return. The exhaustion I felt in the mornings now had a terrifying explanation. My body was going somewhere, doing something, and coming back drained. Where was I going? What was I doing there? The camera's static was a barrier, a veil hiding my nightly destination. Curiosity became an obsession that consumed all my thoughts. I went to the city records office and asked for the building's blueprints. The clerk looked at me strangely when I explained I just wanted to check the structure of my floor. I spent an hour in a dusty room, with the blueprints spread out on a table. The paper was old and brittle. Just as I suspected, behind my wall there was nothing. just a load-bearing wall, structural columns, and the network of pipes and wires that ran up the building's spine. There were no hidden spaces, no forgotten rooms. The place I was going wasn't on any map. It wasn't in this world. The signs of my nightly journeys became stranger. One morning I woke up with damp hair as if I'd walked in the rain, and with that ozone smell, like air after a thunderstorm. Another time my feet were covered in a fine black sand that didn't look like any beach sand I had ever seen. And the exhaustion was getting worse. I felt weak, consumed. It was as if my journeys were draining the life out of me, night after night. I tried everything to stay awake. I drank liters of coffee, took cold showers, blasted music. I managed to stay awake for one entire night. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The next day I was so exhausted that I fell asleep at 7 in the evening. The video from that night showed that my ritual had simply moved up. I got up, walked through the wall, and returned the next morning, more exhausted than ever. I couldn't escape. My own body and my need for sleep were my jailers. I started to be afraid of my own apartment, of my own room. The wall that was once just a painted surface now seemed like a portal, a wound in reality. Sometimes during the day I thought I could hear faint sounds coming from inside it. A low murmur, a distant wind. I would press my ear against it, but the sound would always fade, leaving me to wonder if I had truly heard it or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The situation reached a breaking point one Thursday morning. I woke up, as always, feeling like I'd been run over by a truck. But this time, something was different. As I uncurled my right hand, which I had kept clenched in a fist while sleeping, I felt a small, smooth object in my palm. I opened it carefully. It was a stone. A small, perfectly round, polished black stone, almost like obsidian. It was cold to the touch and didn't resemble any stone I had seen in the city. I sat on the bed staring at the stone as terror settled in my stomach like a block of ice. Until now I had come back with traces, with sensations. Sand, mud, dampness. But this was different. This was an object. A solid object from the place I went every night. I had brought it with me. For the first time I had physical proof of the other side, and that opened a door to a terrifying possibility. If I could bring things from there to here, what was stopping something from over there from following me back? The wall was not a one-way door. It was a passage, and I was the one opening it every night. The exhaustion was no longer my biggest fear. My biggest fear was what might be awake beside me one morning, what might have crossed the threshold while I slept, using my own body as the key. The polished black stone became the center of my universe. I carried it with me everywhere, in my pants pocket, a constant heavy reminder of my terrifying duality. During the day I would take it out and roll it between my fingers, its smooth, cold surface the only real thing in a world that was becoming increasingly insubstantial. At work I would stare blankly at the computer screen, but I didn't see the numbers or the reports. I saw the camera's static, the white noise that hid the secret of my travels. What was that place? An incredibly vivid, lucid dream? Another dimension? Or just a hallucination? An elaborate theater staged by a mind that was breaking down? But the stone was real. The stone was proof that I wasn't crazy. My next step was an act of logical desperation. If I was the door, I needed to know what was on the other side. The camera's static was the problem. It was as if the presence of that other place interfered with electronic devices. I needed an analog solution. I dusted off an old film camera that had belonged to my father, a relic from the 80s. I bought several rolls of high-sensitivity film, the kind used for night photography. My plan was risky and, in hindsight, incredibly stupid. I programmed the camera to take one picture every 30 minutes throughout the night using a cabled remote shutter. I set it up on a tripod, aiming at the wall. My hope was that, even if the digital camera collapsed, the purely mechanical and chemical nature of analog photography might capture something, anything, an image that survived the static. The first attempt was a failure. The next morning, I had the film developed at a photo shop downtown. The man at the counter looked at me strangely when I handed him a roll full of pictures of an empty wall. All the photos were identical, A grainy image of my bedroom up until 3 in the morning. The photo from 3:30, and all the following ones until 5:30, came out completely black, as if the lens cap had been on. It wasn't static, it was a total absence of light. The darkness on the other side was so absolute that not even the high-sensitivity film could capture a single photon. I went home demoralized. My plan hadn't worked. But that night, reviewing the digital camera's video, I noticed something new. Just before the image turned to static, in the instant my nighttime self touched the wall, there was a flash of light in the recording. It was the flash from the film camera firing, and in that fraction of a second before everything turned to white noise, the wall behind me wasn't a wall. For a fleeting instant it seemed to dissolve, revealing a landscape. I couldn't make out the details, but it wasn't a room. It looked like an exterior, dark and vast. I repeated the experiment, but this time I changed the film camera's settings. I programmed it to fire a burst of shots at the exact moment I usually got up, at 3:03. It was a gamble, but it was the only one I had. That night, I struggled to sleep. The idea of what the camera might capture filled me with an almost paralyzing terror. The next morning, I took the roll to be developed with trembling hands. When I returned to pick up the photos, the clerk handed them to me in an envelope without making eye contact. I left the shop and sat on a bench outside. I opened the envelope. Most of the photos were black, synchronization failures. But one of them, just one, had captured the moment. The image took my breath away. It was blurry, slightly out of focus, but unmistakable. It showed me from behind, about to walk through the wall. But the wall wasn't there. In its place, there was a landscape of impossible desolation. The ground was the fine black sand I had found on my feet, stretching to a horizon that was lost in a gray haze. The sky had no stars, no moon, no clouds. It was a dark purple, like a giant bruise. And everywhere, rising from the sand, were structures that looked like dead trees. But instead of branches, they had strange geometric shapes, spirals and sharp angles that defied logic. There were no signs of life, only a silence and stillness that seemed absolute. It was a dead landscape, a place where nothing had ever grown and nothing ever would. This was the place I went to rest every night. The exhaustion I felt now had a new meaning. It wasn't physical fatigue. It was a weariness of the soul. Every night my spirit, or whatever it was, traveled to that desolate wasteland. What did I do there? Just wander through that sterile nothingness for hours? The idea was almost worse than facing a monster. It was a hell of loneliness and emptiness. The black stone in my pocket now felt incredibly heavy. It was a piece of that world, a souvenir from my own personal purgatory. The problem got worse. I started bringing more things back. One morning I woke up with a handful of black sand. Another time, with a piece of one of those geometric branches, which felt like cold, porous ceramic to the touch. My apartment was becoming a small museum of a dead world, and the fear that something would follow me back became unbearable. I decided I had to stop the journey, not just the sleep. I had to prevent my physical body from getting up. The solution was drastic. The next night, before bed, I tied myself to the bed. I used leather belts strapping my wrists and ankles to the legs of the solid iron bed frame. I made sure the buckles were tight, enough that I couldn't get free even with a conscious effort. I felt vulnerable and ridiculous, but it was my last hope. I fell asleep to the sound of leather creaking every time I moved. The next morning, I woke to a sharp pain in my wrists and ankles. The leather straps were incredibly taut, and my skin was raw beneath them. I had fought against my restraints all night, but they had held. I watched the camera's video. The footage was terrifying. At 3:03, my body sat up, as always. Then, it tried to stand. Feeling the resistance of the belts, it began to pull. It pulled with inhuman strength, the entire body convulsing, muscles tensed. It was not my strength. It was the strength of something that desperately wanted out. For over 2 hours, my body fought its bonds, twisting and pulling, while my sleeping face remained completely expressionless. finally, around the time I usually returned, my body collapsed back onto the bed, motionless. It had worked. I had prevented the journey. But the cost was terrible. The exhaustion that morning was the worst I had ever felt. I felt like I had been beaten. But there was something else. A new feeling. A feeling of rage. Not my rage. It was a cold alien rage that seemed to emanate from my own body. It was the frustration of the thing that had been unable to leave. I repeated the process the next night, and the next. Each morning I woke up more sore, more exhausted, and with that feeling of a contained fury growing inside me. I was winning the battle, but I was losing the war. I was destroying my own body to keep my spirit prisoner. On the fourth night, something changed. I tied myself up as usual and fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, not from a noise, but from an absence of pressure. I opened my eyes. I was standing in the middle of the room. The leather straps were on the floor next to the bed. All of them had been cut cleanly, as if with a sharp knife. I looked at my hands. In my right hand, I was holding the polished black stone, but it wasn't round anymore. It had a sharp edge like a piece of flint. I had used the stone from the other world to free myself in this one. The camera confirmed it in the morning. My sleeping self had sat up, taken the stone from the nightstand, and with methodical patience had cut through each of the leather straps. Then he had walked through the wall. That morning, upon returning, I brought something new. It wasn't a stone or a piece of a branch. When I woke up, I felt a weight on my chest. I opened my eyes and saw a small creature, the size of a large insect, perched on my sternum. It was matte black, with multiple thin legs and a segmented body. It wasn't moving. I was paralyzed with terror. Slowly, I raised a hand to brush it away, but before I could touch it, the creature disintegrated. It dissolved into a handful of black sand which scattered across my chest and the sheets. I jumped out of bed, brushing the sand off in disgust. It was a warning, or something worse. It was a test. The door was opening wider. The barrier between the two worlds was becoming permeable. I was no longer just bringing back inanimate objects. I was starting to bring back life, or the imitation of life that existed in that dead place. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to leave the apartment. I had to flee. But would it do any good? If I was the door would go with me. As I packed a bag with trembling hands, my gaze fell on the wall. The smooth, innocent wall. And I had an idea. A terrible, desperate idea, a final gamble. I couldn't close the door from here. But maybe, just maybe, I could destroy it. Not the physical wall. The portal. That night, I didn't tie myself up. I didn't set up the camera. I sat on the floor facing the wall and waited. At 3:03, I felt the pull, the compulsion to get up. I fought it with all my strength, concentrating on staying seated. It was agony. My body wanted to move, but my mind resisted. And then, the wall began to change. It stopped being opaque. It became translucent, like smoked glass. And I saw what was on the other side. I saw the landscape of black sand and geometric trees. And I saw myself, my other self. He was standing on the other side in that purple world, looking at me. But he wasn't alone. Beside him there was a figure, tall, thin, and wrapped in shadows, a silhouette of pure darkness. And that figure raised a hand and motioned for me, inviting me to cross. My other self began to walk toward me, and I knew that if our two bodies touched, if the two versions of myself merged, the door would open forever, and the shadow figure could cross. At the last second, with the last ounce of my will, I did the only thing I could think of. I leaped up and ran, but not toward the apartment door. I ran directly at the wall, at my other self. I screamed, a scream of defiance and absolute terror, and threw myself at the translucent image, not to pass through, but to shatter it. The impact was a burst of white light and a pain unlike anything I had ever felt. And then, nothing. The wall was solid, the room still. I stood frozen, my breath shallow. From the corner of my eye, a shadow flickered against the wall, a silhouette I did not recognize. It wasn't me.